The exploration vessel Wanderer had been circling the frozen planet for 3 weeks now, and Captain Daniel Harrison was starting to think they had wasted their time. The ice world called Theta 7 looked completely dead from orbit, with nothing but white plains and frozen oceans stretching across its entire surface. The science team had detected some unusual heat signatures in the northern regions, but everyone assumed they were just volcanic vents or geothermal activity. It was Chief Science Officer Linda Martinez who first suggested that the patterns were too regular to be natural, and she convinced the captain to take a closer look with the deep scanners. What they found changed everything. Hidden beneath layers of ice and snow were structures that could only be made by intelligent hands. There were villages clustered around heat sources and pathways connecting them that showed clear signs of regular use. The readings indicated a civilization that was pre-industrial and struggling to survive in conditions that would kill most known species within hours. Linda ran the numbers 3 times to make sure she was reading them correctly, and each time the results showed the same disturbing truth. The planet was getting colder and the beings down there were running out of time. Captain Harrison called a meeting of the senior staff to discuss their options. The Federation had strict rules about contacting primitive civilizations and interfering with their natural development. But these rules also had exceptions for species facing immediate extinction, and Theta 7 definitely qualified. The planet's sun was entering a cooling phase that would last for thousands of years, and without help, the natives would be gone within a generation or 2. The debate went on for hours, with some officers arguing for immediate intervention, and others insisting they follow protocol and simply observe. It was Dr. Sophie Turner who finally broke the deadlock by pointing out that they could at least make contact and assess the situation before deciding on further action. The decision to bring Emma Collins on the landing party was made almost by accident. The 6-year-old daughter of engineer Peter Collins and Dr. Turner had been pestering everyone on the ship about when they would meet aliens. She had grown up on starships and space stations and had never seen another intelligent species besides humans. Emma was a bright child with curly brown hair and endless curiosity about everything around her. She had been studying the alien contact protocols in the ship's education center and could recite the first contact guidelines better than some of the crew members. When her mother mentioned the upcoming mission at dinner, Emma immediately demanded to come along. Peter Collins was against the idea from the start. He argued that bringing a child to an unknown planet with unknown dangers was irresponsible and violated half a dozen safety regulations. But Sophie saw something her husband did not. She had studied enough xenoanthropology to know that appearing non-threatening was crucial in first contact situations, and nothing said peaceful intentions like bringing your children along. Emma's presence would show the natives that the humans trusted them enough to bring their most vulnerable members. After much discussion and several safety compromises, Peter reluctantly agreed. The landing party assembled in the shuttle bay early the next morning. Captain Harrison would lead the team with Dr. Turner as medical officer and cultural liaison. Dr. Henry Blake, the ship's xenoanthropologist, would handle the scientific observations and cultural analysis. Security Officer Karen Wright would provide protection if things went wrong, though everyone hoped her weapons would stay holstered, and Emma would be there as their secret weapon of innocence and trust. The shuttle dropped through the atmosphere of Theta 7, and immediately the crew felt the bone-deep cold even through the insulated hull. They landed near the largest heat signature, about half a kilometer from what appeared to be the main village. The temperature outside was -40 degrees, and the wind cut through their thermal suits like knives. Emma held her mother's hand tightly as they made their way across the frozen ground toward the collection of ice structures ahead. She carried her favorite blanket wrapped around her shoulders over her thermal suit. It was a blue blanket her grandmother had given her before they left Earth, and it had heating filaments woven into the fabric that kept her extra warm. Emma never went anywhere without it. The village looked like something out of an ancient Earth fairy tale. Domes made of ice blocks rose from the snow with hide coverings stretched across wooden frames for additional insulation. Smoke rose from vents in the tops of the structures, and figures moved between the buildings wrapped in thick furs. As the humans approached, the activity in the village stopped and dozens of faces turned to stare at the newcomers. The natives were humanoid in basic shape, but covered in thick pale fur that ranged from white to light gray. They stood slightly taller than humans with longer limbs and wider eyes that seemed adapted for the low light conditions. An elder figure stepped forward from the largest structure. He was tall with silvery fur that showed his age, and deep amber eyes that studied. The humans with careful intelligence, Dr. Blake, activated the universal translator device, and the elder's words became understandable. He introduced himself as Theron, the leader of this village, and welcomed the strangers with cautious courtesy. Captain Harrison explained that they came from the stars and meant no harm, but simply wished to learn about the people of this world. Theron listened carefully and then invited them to enter the village and share warmth by the fire. As they walked through the settlement, Emma saw more of the natives and her heart began to ache. The Kalari, as they called themselves, looked cold despite their fur. They moved slowly as if conserving energy, and their eyes held a desperate hunger that spoke of too many meals missed. Children huddled together in groups, their small forms pressed close for warmth. Emma noticed that some of the younger ones had patchy fur that did not cover them properly, and they shivered constantly, even when sitting next to the fires. She had never seen suffering like this before, and something inside her shifted. Theron led them to the central fire pit where the village elders gathered. He explained through the translator that this winter had been the worst anyone could remember. The ice had come earlier and harder than ever before, and their food stores were running low. Several members of the tribe had already died from the cold, and more would follow before spring came, if it came at all. The Kalari had legends that said the world was slowly freezing, and that one day the warmth would leave forever. Theron spoke these words, without emotion, as if he had already accepted the fate of his people. Emma listened to all of this while watching the Kalari around her, and she made a decision that would change the course of history for two species. The interior of Theron's dwelling was warmer than outside, but still cold enough that Emma could see her breath misting in the air. The walls were made of ice blocks carved with intricate patterns that seemed to serve both decorative and functional purposes by channeling heat from the central fire pit. Furs and hides covered the floor and hung from the ceiling, creating pockets of slightly warmer air. The Kalari sat in a circle around the fire, and the humans joined them, with Emma settling between her mother and Dr. Blake. Theron began to tell them the history of his people, and Dr. Blake recorded everything with fascinated attention. The Kalari had lived on this world for as long as their stories remembered, and they had always known the cold. Their ancestors had been able to survive the winters by hunting large creatures that migrated across the ice plains and by gathering plants that grew during the brief summer months. But over the last several generations, the summers had become shorter and the winters longer. The great beasts that their people had hunted were disappearing, moving to warmer regions that the Kalari could not reach. The plants that once sustained them were dying out, and even their traditional methods of storing food were becoming inadequate. Dr. Blake asked questions about their technology and social structure while taking careful notes. The Kalari had developed sophisticated techniques for working with ice and hide, but had no metals because nothing could be mined from the frozen ground. They had fire, but fuel was scarce and had to be rationed carefully. Their society was organized into family groups that came together to form villages during the winter and spread out during the summer to hunt and gather. Each family was responsible for its own survival, and sharing between families had become rare as resources grew scarcer. Theron admitted with obvious shame that the strong families now let the weak ones die rather than sharing their precious food and fuel. Emma listened to all of this, but her attention kept drifting to the Kalari. Children she could see through the doorway. They played in the snow, but their games seemed slow and tired compared to how Emma and her friends played on the ship. She noticed that the adults kept watching the children with expressions of deep sadness, as if they were mourning them while they still lived. One small child stumbled while running and lay in the snow for several seconds before getting up, and Emma realized with horror that the child was simply too weak to stand quickly. Dr. Turner asked about their medical practices, and Theron called for the village healer to join them. An older female Kalari entered the dwelling and sat by the fire. Her name was Kendra, and her fur was streaked with white from age. She explained that her knowledge came from generations of healers before her, but much of that knowledge was becoming useless. The traditional herbs that treated various ailments no longer grew, and the techniques for setting broken bones and treating injuries could do nothing against the cold that was killing her people. Kendra said that in recent years most of her work had been helping the dying pass peacefully, rather than healing the sick. The conversation turned to the broader situation facing the Kalari species. Theron revealed that there were other villages scattered across the northern regions, where geothermal heat made survival possible. He had no way of knowing how many Kalari remained in total, but he estimated perhaps 10,000 at most. The villages had little contact with each other because travel across the ice was dangerous and took valuable energy that could not be spared. Theron believed that some villages had already been abandoned, and their people either moved elsewhere or died. The Kalari as a species were facing extinction within a few generations, and they knew it. Captain Harrison asked if the Kalari would accept help from the humans. Theron considered the question carefully before answering. He said that his people had legends of beings from the sky who would come in their darkest hour. Some legends said these beings would save the Kalari, while others said they would judge the Kalari and find them wanting. Theron did not know which legend was true, but he was willing to accept whatever help the humans could offer, because the alternative was watching his people die. The other elders around the fire nodded in agreement, and Emma saw the desperate hope in their eyes. The meeting continued for another hour, as the two groups discussed possibilities and limitations. Captain Harrison explained that he would need to contact his superiors before providing any significant aid, because there were rules about helping primitive civilizations. The Kalari did not fully understand these rules, but they accepted them. Dr. Blake talked about different types of help that might be possible, from teaching new survival techniques to providing technological assistance. Theron listened carefully to everything and asked intelligent questions that showed he understood more than the humans initially expected. As the formal meeting concluded, Theron invited the humans to see more of the village before they returned to their ship. He wanted them to understand the full scope of what his people faced, so they could better explain the situation to their leaders. The group stood and began to file out of the dwelling back into the bitter cold outside. Emma pulled her thermal blanket tighter around her shoulders and felt the heating elements warm against her skin. She felt guilty for being warm when everyone around her was suffering. They walked through the village, and Theron pointed out different structures and explained their purposes. There was a communal food storage area that was nearly empty, with only enough supplies to last another few weeks at most. There was a workshop where Kalari craftsmen made tools and clothing from ice and hide, using techniques passed down through generations. There was a gathering place where the village came together for ceremonies and celebrations, though Theron admitted sadly that there had been few celebrations recently. And there were the family dwellings where parents tried to keep their children alive through another brutal night. It was at one of these family dwellings that Emma saw something that broke her heart completely. A young Kalari mother sat outside the entrance holding an infant wrapped in thin furs. The mother's name was Lisa, and her baby could not have been more than a few months old. The infant's fur was patchy and thin, revealing pale skin underneath that looked blue from cold. Both mother and child were shivering violently, and the baby made weak crying sounds that spoke of exhaustion and hunger. Lisa looked up at the humans with eyes that held no hope, only the determination to hold her child for as long as possible before the cold took them. Both Dr. Turner immediately went to examine the infant, and Lisa allowed it with the resignation of someone who expected nothing to help. Sophie ran her medical scanner over the baby, and her expression grew grim. She explained quietly to Captain Harrison that the infant was severely malnourished and suffering from hypothermia. Without intervention, the child would die within days, perhaps hours. Lisa seemed to understand even without translation, and she simply held her baby closer and began singing a soft melody that Emma somehow knew was a lullaby. Emma stood watching this scene and felt tears freezing on her cheeks, and she knew she had to do something right then. Emma did not think about Federation protocols or first contact rules or what her parents might say. She only saw a baby who was cold and dying, and she had something that could help. Before anyone could stop her, she unwrapped the blue thermal blanket from around her shoulders and stepped forward toward Lisa and her infant. The Kalari mother looked at the small human child approaching, and there was confusion in her amber eyes. Emma held out the blanket and gestured toward the baby, trying to communicate her intention through action since she did not know the language well enough yet. Lisa hesitated and looked toward Theron as if asking permission or guidance. The elder Kalari studied Emma carefully and then nodded slowly. Lisa shifted the baby in her arms, and Emma gently draped the blue blanket over the infant, wrapping it carefully around the small, shivering form. The heating filaments in the blanket activated automatically when they detected the cold, and within seconds the fabric began radiating warmth. The change in the baby was immediate and remarkable. The violent shivering slowed and then stopped. The weak crying faded to silence and then to what sounded almost like a contented coo. The blue tint in the baby's skin began to fade as circulation improved. Lisa stared at the blanket in wonder and then at Emma. Tears formed in her eyes and began rolling down her fur-covered cheeks. She spoke rapidly in her own language, and while the translator rendered the words, it could not capture the emotion behind them. She was thanking Emma with every word she knew and blessing her and calling her a gift from the sky and the stars. Lisa pulled Emma close with one arm while holding her warming baby with the other, and Emma found herself wrapped in a hug from an alien, a mother whose gratitude transcended species and language. The other Kalari in the village had stopped what they were doing and were gathering around to see what was happening. They whispered among themselves and pointed at the blue blanket and at Emma. Their expressions showed amazement and something else that Dr. Blake recognized immediately as religious awe. He activated his recorder to capture everything because he sensed they were witnessing something significant that went beyond a simple act of kindness. Captain Harrison started to step forward, perhaps to retrieve the blanket and restore proper protocols, but Dr. Turner caught his arm and shook her head. She understood that what was happening here was more important than any rule in the Federation handbook. Theron approached slowly and knelt down beside Emma so he could look into her eyes at her level. He spoke carefully, choosing his words with obvious thought. He told Emma that what she had done was more than just giving warmth to a cold baby. She had demonstrated a principle that the Kalari had forgotten in their struggle to survive. She had shown that compassion and sharing could exist even between strangers, even between different species. She had given away something precious to herself to help someone she did not know and would probably never see again. This act, Theron said, reminded him of the old ways when Kalari, families shared everything and no one went cold or hungry, while others had plenty. The elder stood and addressed the gathering crowd of Kalari in a loud voice that carried across the village. He spoke of legends and prophecies that had been passed down through generations. He talked about the old stories that told of a small being who would come from the sky in the darkest time and show the Kalari the path to survival through an act of pure giving. Some of the older Kalari nodded as they recognized the stories, while younger ones listened with growing excitement. Theron said he did not know if Emma was the one from the prophecy, but he knew that her example was one they all needed to follow. Dr. Blake was recording everything and muttering to himself about the implications. He explained to Captain Harrison that many primitive cultures had messianic prophecies, and that first contact situations often got interpreted through these existing belief systems. The danger was that the Kalari might start worshipping Emma, or expecting miracles that the humans could not provide. But the opportunity was that this moment of symbolic importance could be used to introduce positive changes to Kalari society. Harrison listened, but he was more concerned about explaining to Federation Command why he had allowed a 6-year-old to potentially alter the development of an entire civilization. Emma herself was not thinking about any of this. She was cold without her blanket and she missed its warmth already. But when she looked at the baby now sleeping peacefully in Lissa's arms wrapped in blue thermal fabric, she felt something warm inside her chest that had nothing to do with heating filaments. Her mother hugged her close and whispered that she was proud of her, even if she had broken about 10 different rules. Emma asked if she was in trouble, and Sophie laughed and said that sometimes the right thing to do was also the wrong thing according to rules, and that Emma would understand better. When she was older, the Kalari began bringing gifts to Emma despite her protests and her parents' attempts to refuse them. They brought carved ice figures and woven hide bracelets and polished stones that had been treasured in families for generations. They brought food that they could not spare and offered shelter and warmth that they desperately needed for themselves. Theron had to intervene and tell his people to stop because the humans could not accept these sacrifices. But he allowed one gift to be given. An elderly Kalari female approached Emma and placed a necklace around her neck. It was made of carved bone beads strung on braided hide, and it was clearly very old. The woman spoke, and the translator said she was giving Emma a family heirloom that had been passed from mother to daughter for 20 generations. Now it belonged to Emma as a symbol of the bond between their peoples. As the sun began to set and the temperature dropped even further, Captain Harrison decided it was time to return to the ship. They had accomplished the initial contact and gathered valuable information about the Kalari situation. Now they needed to report back to Federation Command and request permission for further intervention. The Kalari seemed disappointed that the humans were leaving, but Theron understood. They had to consult with their elders just as he would need to consult with other village leaders about what had happened today. Emma looked back at Lissa and the baby as they walked toward the shuttle. The mother was sitting by a fire pit with her infant still wrapped in the blue blanket, and for the first time since the humans had arrived, Lissa was smiling. Other Kalari mothers were gathering around her asking to touch the blanket and see the baby who had been saved by the Sky Child. Emma could hear their voices carrying across the cold air filled with wonder and hope. She felt her mother's hand squeeze her shoulder, and when she looked up, Sophie was smiling too, even though there were tears on her face. The walk back to the shuttle seemed longer than the walk to the village. Emma was shivering now without her blanket, and the cold was biting through her thermal suit. Karen Wright noticed and offered Emma her own coat, but the child refused, saying that she could handle being cold for a little while, because she knew it would end when they got back to the warm ship. The security officer nodded with respect in her eyes because she understood that Emma had learned something important about sacrifice and perspective. When they reached the shuttle and the hatch closed behind them, the warmth of the interior felt almost shocking after the brutal cold. Outside, Captain Harrison sat heavily in the pilot's seat and stared at the controls for a long moment before activating them, and he knew his report was going to be very complicated to write. The shuttle had barely lifted off from the frozen surface when Theron called an emergency council meeting. This was highly unusual, because such councils normally required days of preparation and consultation with spiritual advisors. But the elder knew that what had happened with the human child was too important to wait for normal procedures. He sent runners to the other senior members of the village and to representatives from 2 nearby settlements that were within a day's travel. The message was simple but urgent. The sky beings had come and the prophecy might be unfolding. By the time night had fully fallen, the council chamber was filled with Kalari elders and spiritual leaders. The chamber was the oldest structure in the village, carved deep into the ice by ancestors generations past. The walls were covered with murals depicting the history of the Kalari people from their earliest days to the present. One mural in particular showed a small figure descending from the stars surrounded by light and warmth. It had been painted so long ago that no one remembered who had created it or exactly what it meant, but the prophecy associated with it had been passed down through oral tradition for thousands of years. Theron stood before the assembled council and recounted everything that had happened. He described the arrival of the humans in their flying vessel and their strange appearance so different from any being the Kalari had ever known. He talked about their advanced tools that could translate language and measure illness and create warmth from nothing. He explained how the humans had shown concern for the Kalari suffering and had asked many questions about their situation. And then he told them about Emma and the blue blanket and what she had done for Lissa's dying baby. The council chamber fell silent as Theron finished his account. Then one of the oldest spiritual leaders rose to speak. Her name was Vera, and she was ancient even by Kalari standards, with fur that had gone pure white and eyes that had seen more winters than most Kalari would ever live through. She spoke in a voice that trembled with age but carried absolute authority. Vera recited the prophecy from memory word for word as it had been taught to her when she was young. The small warmth bringer will come when hope fades and ice claims all. Not with strength or power, but with open hands will salvation be shown. The child of distant stars will teach what was forgotten, that survival comes not from taking but from giving. Another elder named Marcus questioned whether they could be certain this prophecy referred to Emma. He pointed out that prophecies were often vague and could be interpreted many ways. Perhaps the humans were simply kind beings who happened to arrive at a desperate time. Perhaps Emma's act was just the natural compassion of a child who did not understand the complexities of resource scarcity and survival. Marcus argued that they should not build too much hope on ancient words that might mean nothing. The Kalari had to deal with reality, not dreams, and the reality was that they were dying regardless of what any prophecy said. But Lissa stood up holding her baby, who was still wrapped in the blue blanket and still warm and alive when, hours ago, death had seemed certain. She spoke with the fierce conviction of a mother who had watched her child suffer, and then seen that suffering ended by an act of pure generosity. Lissa said she did not care about prophecies or interpretations or whether Emma was sent by fate or chance. What mattered was that a small human child had seen a need and filled it without hesitation or calculation. That was the lesson they needed to learn. That was what the Kalari had lost in their desperation to survive as Individuals and families rather than as a community. Kendra, the healer, added her voice to Lissa's. She reminded the council that in the old days before the Great Cold began, the Kalari had lived by principles of sharing and mutual support. No family went hungry while another had food. No child froze while another family had extra furs. But as resources became scarcer, those principles had been abandoned. Each family had withdrawn into itself, hoarding what little it had, and viewing other families as competitors rather than kin. Kendra said that this isolation had weakened them more than the cold ever could. A people divided could not survive what was coming, but a people united might find a way. Theron let the debate continue for hours, listening carefully to every voice and every argument. Some council members agreed with Vera and Lisa that Emma's act was a sign they needed to change their ways. Others sided with Marcus, arguing that sentiment and prophecy would not fill empty food stores or warm frozen children. A few suggested that the humans themselves were the real answer, and that the Kalari should focus on obtaining more of their advanced technology rather than looking for moral lessons. The discussion went in circles as different factions tried to convince each other of their positions. Finally, Theron raised his hand for silence, and the council chamber grew quiet. He acknowledged that they could not know for certain whether Emma was the fulfillment of ancient prophecy or just a compassionate child. He agreed that warm feelings would not solve the practical problems of food and shelter and survival. But he also pointed out that their current path was leading only to extinction. The isolated family-first approach was not working, and had not been working for generations. They had nothing to lose by trying something different and everything to gain if it worked. The elder proposed a radical experiment. For one season, the village would return to the old ways of communal sharing and support. Families would pool their resources instead of hoarding them. The strong would help the weak instead of leaving them to die. They would hunt and gather as a unified group and distribute food based on need rather than individual family success. If this approach failed, they would be no worse off than they already were. But if it succeeded even partially, they might buy themselves time to find other solutions, and perhaps the humans would be more willing to help a people who showed they could work together rather than a collection of desperate families fighting each other for scraps. The vote was not unanimous, but it was enough. The council agreed to try Theron's experiment for one season, starting immediately. They would send word to the other nearby villages and invite them to join the effort. They would reorganize their entire social structure around cooperation and mutual aid, and they would do all of this in memory of what a 6-year-old human child had taught them by giving away her blanket to a stranger's baby. Several council members were openly weeping as they voted, including Marcus, who had argued against it but could not deny the desperate need for something to change. Vera stood once more and declared that whether or not Emma was the prophesied one, she had certainly been a catalyst for transformation. The ancient spiritual leader pronounced a blessing on the human child and on her people, and on the new path the Kalari were choosing to walk. She said that sometimes salvation came not as a rescue from outside, but as a reminder of truths already known but forgotten. The humans had not saved the Kalari, but they had shown the Kalari how to save themselves. That was a greater gift than any technology or material aid could provide. As the council meeting ended and the elders began to disperse to inform their families of the decision, Lissa approached Theron privately. She asked what they should do about the blue blanket that still kept her baby warm. Should they try to return it to Emma when the humans came back, or should they keep it as a symbol of the new beginning? Theron considered the question carefully. He said they would keep the blanket for now and care for it as a sacred object, but ultimately the decision about its fate would belong to Emma herself when she was old, enough to understand what her simple act had set in motion. The night deepened and the temperature dropped further, as it always did in the hours before dawn. But in the Kalari village, something had changed that had nothing to do with temperature. Families began emerging from their individual dwellings and gathering at the central fire pit. They brought what food they had and laid it out for communal distribution. They brought furs and tools and fuel and offered them to the group, rather than hoarding them. Children who had been kept separate out of fear that feeding others' children meant less for their own were allowed to play together and were watched over by all the adults. It was a small beginning and fragile and uncertain, but it was a beginning, and that was more than the Kalari had before a human child had decided that a cold baby needed her blanket more than she did. Captain Harrison's report to Federation Command took 3 days to write, and another 2 days of tense waiting before he received a response. The Federation Council was divided on how to proceed with the Kalari situation. Some admirals wanted to invoke the non-interference directive and pull the Wanderer away from Theta 7 immediately. Others argued that a species facing extinction qualified for emergency humanitarian intervention under special protocols. The debate at the highest levels of Federation government mirrored the arguments happening on the Wanderer itself, where crew members discussed what they should or should not do to help the freezing aliens below. Emma did not understand all the political complications, but she knew the adults were arguing about whether to help people who were dying. She asked her father why they would even debate something that seemed so obvious, and Peter struggled to explain the concept of unintended consequences and the importance of letting civilizations develop naturally. Emma listened politely, and then asked if it was better to let people die naturally than to risk changing their culture by helping them. Peter had no good answer for that, and he hugged his daughter and told her she was too smart for her own good. While the Federation debated, the Kalari acted. Word of the Council's decision spread quickly to neighboring villages, and the response was mixed but mostly positive. Some settlements immediately embraced the return to communal living and began pooling their resources. Others remained skeptical and chose to wait and see if Theron's village survived the experiment before committing themselves. A few villages rejected the idea entirely, arguing that sharing would only mean everyone died together, instead of the strong surviving alone. But enough communities joined the effort to make a difference. Theron organized hunting parties that combined members from multiple families and even multiple villages. These larger groups could take down bigger prey and cover more territory than individual family units working alone. The first successful hunt brought back enough meat to feed 3 villages for a week, and the joy of that success convinced many doubters that cooperation might actually work. The hunters brought their kill to a central location, and Kendra supervised the distribution, making sure that the elderly and the young and the sick received adequate portions before the healthy adults took their share. The village also reorganized its shelter arrangements. Instead of each family maintaining separate dwellings that were difficult to heat, the Kalari began consolidating into larger communal spaces. Multiple families would share a single well-insulated structure with a central fire pit that could warm everyone more efficiently than many small fires. This meant less privacy and more noise and occasional conflicts, but it also meant that no one froze alone in the night. The children especially benefited from this arrangement, as they could play together and keep each other warm while adults took turns watching over all of them. Food storage became a community responsibility rather than a family one. Every bit of preserved meat and dried plant matter was brought to a central location, where Kendra and other trusted elders managed distribution. This required an enormous amount of trust, because families had to give up their private stores with only faith that the community would provide for them in return. There were some instances of hoarding and theft in the early days, but Theron dealt with these quickly and fairly. He reminded everyone that they were all choosing to walk this path together, and that betraying that trust was betraying their own survival. The spiritual dimension of the transformation surprised Dr. Blake when he learned about it on a follow-up visit to the surface. Vera had established what she called remembrance ceremonies, where the community gathered each evening to recite stories about the old ways when Kalari lived in harmony and shared everything. She also instituted a new ritual called the Warming Circle, where the youngest children were brought to the center of the community, and every adult would touch them and speak a blessing. This served both to reinforce communal responsibility for all children and to keep the story of Emma and the blue blanket alive in their collective memory. Lissa's baby became a symbol of the new era and was given the honor name Emma in recognition of the human child who had saved her life. Little Emma, the Kalari infant, thrived under the improved conditions and grew stronger each day. Lisa herself became one of the strongest advocates for the communal approach, and she traveled to other villages with her baby, wrapped in the blue blanket, to show them living proof that change was possible. Many mothers who had been ready to give up hope found new determination when they saw the healthy baby who had been dying just weeks earlier. But the transformation was not easy or simple. There were constant challenges and setbacks. Some families struggled with the loss of autonomy and chafed at communal decisions they disagreed with. Disputes arose over fair distribution of resources and over who should have authority to make decisions. Younger Kalari sometimes questioned why they should listen to prophecies and old stories when practical survival demanded practical solutions. Theron spent most of his time mediating conflicts and trying to hold the fragile new social structure together through patience and persuasion. The weather did not cooperate either. A massive storm hit the region 2 weeks after the council meeting, bringing temperatures that dropped even lower than normal and winds that threatened to tear apart even the sturdiest shelters. The Kalari huddled together in their communal dwellings and burned through fuel at an alarming rate just to stay alive. For 3 days the storm raged, and everyone wondered if their experiment in cooperation would end with them all freezing together. But they survived, and when the storm passed, they found that their consolidated approach to shelter and heating had actually saved fuel compared to what they would have used in separate family dwellings. Federation Command finally issued their decision 12 days after Captain Harrison's initial report. The Wanderer was authorized to provide limited humanitarian aid under strict guidelines. They could offer knowledge and education, but not advanced technology that would fundamentally alter Kalari development. They could provide emergency food and medical supplies, but not permanent infrastructure. They could observe and advise, but not dictate or control. The goal was to help the Kalari survive the current crisis while allowing them to maintain their own path of cultural and technological evolution. It was a compromise that satisfied no one completely, but that everyone could. Except Dr. Turner and Dr. Blake led the first official aid mission back to the surface with supplies and equipment approved by Federation Command. They brought nutritional supplements that could be added to Kalari food to increase its caloric value, without changing the fundamental nature of their diet. They brought medical supplies that Kendra could use to treat injuries and illnesses with training on how to use them properly. They brought portable heat generators that ran on geothermal power so the Kalari could learn to harness the natural heat sources under their ice without becoming dependent on Federation technology. But the most valuable thing the humans brought was Dr. Blake, himself and his knowledge of sustainable survival strategies. He spent hours with Theron and the other elders discussing ways to modify hunting techniques to be more efficient, and how to preserve food more effectively, and how to construct shelters that retained heat better. He shared information about Ice Age survival strategies from Earth's history and from other Cold World species the Federation had encountered. All of this knowledge was practical and achievable with Kalari technology levels and would not violate the non-interference guidelines. Emma came on this second visit as well, and the Kalari reaction to her arrival was almost overwhelming. Children and adults crowded around her wanting to touch her and thank her, and show her what had changed since her first visit. Lissa brought baby Emma forward, and the two Emmas met each other properly for the first time. The human child was amazed and delighted that the baby had been named after her, and she spent nearly an hour just sitting, with Lissa learning to hold the infant properly and singing Earth lullabies that made the Kalari baby coo with contentment. Theron took Captain Harrison aside and thanked him for the aid, but also made clear that the Kalari did not want to become dependent on human charity. He explained what the council had decided and what changes they had implemented and how they were trying to save themselves using the lesson Emma had taught them. The elder said they would gratefully accept knowledge and temporary support, but their goal was to stand on their own feet, or rather their own paws, as a people who had rediscovered their own strength through unity. Harrison was impressed by Theron's wisdom and his determination, and he reported back to Federation Command that the Kalari were proving to be far more resilient and adaptable than initial assessments had suggested. As the humans prepared to leave after a day of teaching and sharing, Emma asked if she could see the baby one more time, and when Lissa heard, she brought little Emma forward, and the blanket was still there, keeping the infant warm. The months that followed brought changes to both the Kalari and the humans that neither side had anticipated. Captain Harrison requested and received permission to establish a semi-permanent observation post on Theta 7 to monitor the Kalari situation and provide ongoing support within approved parameters. The Wanderer remained in orbit, but a small research station was constructed on the surface about 2 kilometers from Theron's village. The station was designed to be minimally intrusive with underground living quarters and geothermal power so it would not look too alien or advanced to the Kalari who visited. Dr. Blake essentially took up residence at the research station along with a rotating staff of scientists and support personnel. His official role was to study Kalari culture and document their adaptation to the crisis. But in practice, he became an informal advisor to Theron and the village council. The two leaders met regularly to discuss problems and solutions, and over time they developed a genuine friendship, despite the vast differences in their backgrounds and species. Blake learned to appreciate Kalari wisdom about living in harmony with a harsh environment, while Theron absorbed human knowledge about resource management and sustainable development. Emma and her family visited the surface frequently, and the young girl became a regular presence in the Kalari village. She played with Kalari children, learning their games and teaching them hers. She helped Lisa care for baby Emma and watched with pride as the infant grew stronger and healthier. She sat with Vera and listened to ancient stories about Kalari history and shared stories from Earth about human struggles and triumphs. The Kalari children adored her and followed her, everywhere calling her the warmth sister and bringing her gifts of carved ice and polished stones. The communal living experiment continued to show positive results but also revealed unexpected challenges. The Kalari were discovering that cooperation required different skills than individual survival. They needed to learn how to make group decisions and resolve conflicts without violence, and trust each other with resources and responsibilities. There were failures and setbacks and moments when the whole structure seemed ready to collapse, but each time they found ways to adapt and improve and grow stronger together. One particular crisis tested the new system severely. A hunting party from Theron's village encountered a group from a non-affiliated village on the Ice Plains, and both groups had tracked the same herd of prey animals. Under the old ways, this would have led to conflict and possibly violence as each group tried to claim the entire herd for themselves. But the hunters from Theron's village remembered the principles of sharing and proposed instead that they combine forces to take down more animals and split the harvest. The other group was suspicious at first, but hunger and pragmatism won out and they agreed. The joint hunt was successful beyond anyone's expectations. The combined party was able to use tactics that neither group could have managed alone, and they brought down enough prey to feed both villages for weeks. More importantly, the hunters from the non-affiliated village saw firsthand how cooperation could benefit everyone. They brought word back to their elders about what they had experienced, and within a month that village had voted to join Theron's communal network. The network was growing not through conquest or coercion but through demonstrated success and voluntary association. Dr. Turner made regular medical visits to the Kalari villages and trained Kendra and other healers in techniques that could be performed with available resources. She taught them about infection prevention and wound care and how to identify and treat various illnesses using methods that did not require advanced technology. Kendra proved to be a brilliant student with an intuitive understanding of healing that sometimes surprised even Sophie. The old Kalari healer began combining human medical knowledge with traditional Kalari practices, creating a hybrid approach that was more effective than either system. Alone, the children became the key to long-term cultural change. Young Kalari who grew up in the communal system did not remember the old isolated family-first mentality. They naturally shared with each other and looked out for younger children and saw the whole community as their extended family. Emma played an important role in this by modeling behavior that Kalari children could imitate. She shared her toys and food without being asked and helped others without expecting anything in return, and showed genuine care for everyone around her regardless of whether they were family or strangers. Peter Collins found himself involved in teaching Kalari craftsmen about improved construction techniques. He showed them how to reinforce ice structures using principles of engineering and architecture that humans had developed. The Kalari adapted these lessons to their own materials and methods, creating buildings that were stronger and better insulated than anything they had made before. One innovation involved using layers of packed snow with air gaps to create insulation, similar to double-paned windows. This simple technique reduced heat loss significantly and made dwellings much more comfortable. As spring approached and temperatures began their slight seasonal rise, the Kalari faced a new question. The communal system had helped them survive the worst winter in memory, but would they continue it when conditions improved? Some families argued that they should return to the old independent ways now that the crisis had passed. Others insisted that the new system should be permanent because it was better in every way. The debate grew heated and threatened to split the community, just as they had finally come together. Theron called another council meeting to address the issue, but this time he invited Emma to attend as well. The 6-year-old sat among the Kalari elders, looking tiny and out of place, but radiating the quiet confidence of a child who had done something important and knew it. Theron asked her to speak about why she had given her blanket to baby Emma and what she had hoped would happen. Emma thought about the question carefully before answering, and when she spoke, her words were simple but profound. She said she had not been thinking about changing Kalari society or fulfilling prophecies or teaching lessons. She had just seen a baby who was cold, and she had something that could make the baby warm, so she shared it. That was all. Emma said she did not think about whether it was fair or whether she would get her blanket back or what other people would think. She just did what felt right in her heart. And she thought maybe that was the real lesson, not that everyone should always share everything, but that when you see someone suffering and you can help, you should help without overthinking it. The council chamber was silent after Emma finished speaking, and then Vera began to laugh, a sound like wind chimes in the cold air. The ancient spiritual leader said that children always spoke the truest wisdom, because they had not yet learned to complicate simple truths. Emma had reminded them that cooperation was not about rules or systems or social structures. It was about recognizing that they were all living beings who suffered and thrived together, and that helping each other was not a strategy for survival, but simply the right way to live. The council voted to continue the communal system, but with modifications that allowed for more individual choice and family autonomy. It was a compromise that blended the best of both approaches. Families would maintain some private resources and decision-making power, but would also contribute to the common good and participate in group hunts and shared meals. The system would be flexible enough to adapt to changing conditions and different personalities while maintaining the core principle of mutual support that had saved them during the crisis. News of the Kalari transformation began to spread beyond Theta 7. Dr. Blake published preliminary reports about the cultural evolution he was witnessing, and the Federation scientific community took notice. Here was a species that had been on the brink of extinction, but had pulled back through a combination of outside inspiration and internal change. The case became a topic of intense study and debate among xenoanthropologists and ethicists trying to understand the relationship between first contact and cultural development. But the most significant development came from an unexpected source. A Federation survey team exploring a nearby star system detected signs of another pre-industrial civilization facing environmental collapse. The Federation Council debated how to handle this new situation, and several members suggested applying what they had learned from the Kalari case. Perhaps limited intervention that inspired self-directed change was better than either complete non-interference or heavy-handed rescue. The Kalari example was beginning to influence broader Federation policy. Emma celebrated her 7th birthday on the research station with both human and Kalari friends in attendance. Lissa brought baby Emma, who was now nearly 6 months old and thriving. The Kalari gave Emma gifts, including a beautiful cloak made from the fur of animals hunted by the communal hunting parties and decorated with intricate ice bead patterns. Vera presented Emma with a scroll made of treated hide that contained the prophecy about the warmth bringer, written in traditional Kalari script. The old spiritual leader said Emma should keep it as a reminder of what one small act of kindness could accomplish. As the party wound down and the Kalari guests prepared to return to their village, Lissa looked at the blue blanket that had saved her daughter's life, and then at Emma Collins with her kind eyes and gentle smile. The Kalari mother explained that the blanket had become more than just a warm piece of fabric. It was a sacred object that represented hope and change and the bond between two species. She said the blanket should remain with baby Emma as a reminder of where she came from and what her name meant. When little Emma was old enough to understand, she would be told the story of the human child who gave warmth to a stranger and sparked a revolution in how the Kalari lived. But the story that began with a simple act of compassion on a frozen planet was about to become much more complicated. News of what happened on Theta 7 reached the core worlds of the Federation, and public reaction was intensely divided. Some people saw Emma's gesture and the Kalari transformation as a beautiful example of the best qualities of both humanity and the Federation's mission. Others saw it as a dangerous precedent that violated fundamental principles of non-interference and self-determination for primitive Species Admiral Frank Peterson became the most vocal critic of how the Theta 7 situation had been handled. He was a decorated officer with 40 years of service and a reputation for strict adherence to regulations. Peterson filed a formal complaint against Captain Harrison, arguing that allowing a child to give technology to natives and then providing ongoing aid had crossed clear ethical lines. The Admiral demanded a full investigation and possible court-martial for violations of first contact protocols. His complaint found support among conservative factions in the ER Federation who believed strongly in non-interference policies. The media coverage of the controversy brought Emma's story to billions of people across the Federation. Images of the small human girl wrapping her blanket around a dying alien infant were broadcast on every major network. Interviews with Dr. Blake about the Kalari cultural transformation became required viewing in xenoanthropology classes. Public opinion polls showed that most Federation citizens supported what had been done on Theta 7, but a significant minority agreed with Peterson that the rules existed for good reasons and should not be bent even for sympathetic cases. Captain Harrison found himself at the center of a political firestorm he had never wanted. He spent weeks preparing his defense with help from Federation legal experts and testimonials from his crew. Dr. Turner wrote a passionate statement about medical ethics and the obligation to prevent suffering when possible. Dr. Blake submitted hundreds of pages of research showing that the Kalari had made their own choices and that human contact had merely catalyzed changes the Kalari were already capable of making. Even Linda Martinez, the science officer, contributed data showing that without intervention, the Kalari would likely have gone extinct within 3 generations. The Federation Council called a formal hearing to examine the Theta 7 case and determine whether protocols had been violated, and if so, what consequences were appropriate. The hearing was held on Earth at Federation headquarters and was broadcast live across the entire Federation. Captain Harrison and his senior staff were required to attend and testify. Emma and her family were also summoned to appear, though. There was debate about whether a 7-year-old should be subjected to such scrutiny. Theron requested permission to attend the hearing as well, and the Federation Council agreed after considerable discussion. This would be the first time a Kalari had left Theta 7, and the journey would require Theron to adapt to environments and technologies far beyond anything his people had experienced. The Elder spent 2 weeks in training, learning how to function in standard gravity and how to tolerate warmer temperatures, and how to interact with the overwhelming complexity of Federation society. He was determined to speak on behalf of his people and to make sure their voice was heard in decisions about their future. The hearing began on a cold morning in Geneva with hundreds of spectators filling the gallery and millions more watching on screens across the galaxy. Admiral Peterson presented his case, first arguing that the Theta 7 incident represented a breakdown in discipline and judgment. He acknowledged that the Kalari were suffering, but insisted that the Federation had no right to interfere with their natural development, even if that development led to extinction. Peterson said that if they made exceptions for sympathetic cases, they would end up imposing human values on every primitive species they encountered, and that was a form of cultural imperialism, no matter how well-intentioned. The Admiral's presentation was thorough and legalistic and deeply uncomfortable for everyone who had been on Theta 7. He showed how Captain Harrison's actions had violated specific regulations and how the ongoing aid program exceeded approved parameters. Peterson brought expert witnesses who testified about the dangers of dependency and cultural contamination. He painted a picture of the Kalari as victims of human arrogance who had been robbed of the chance to evolve on their own terms. Several council members nodded along with his arguments, and it seemed the case against Harrison was strong. Then it was time for the defense to present their side. Dr. Blake took the stand first and methodically dismantled Peterson's arguments. He showed evidence that the Kalari were not becoming dependent on human technology, but were instead using human knowledge to develop their own solutions. He presented data on the cultural changes in Kalari society and demonstrated that these changes were consistent with their own historical values, not impositions from outside. Blake argued that the Federation's non-interference doctrine was meant to prevent exploitation and domination, not to turn away from beings in desperate need. Dr. Turner testified about the medical situations she had found on Theta 7, and the ethical impossibility of watching children die when simple interventions could save them. She spoke about baby Emma specifically and described the infant's condition in clinical detail. Then she asked the council members if any of them could honestly say they would have withheld help from a dying baby to preserve abstract principles about cultural purity. The question hung in the air and no one answered, but several council members looked uncomfortable. Captain Harrison's testimony was brief and direct. He acknowledged that he had bent some rules and made decisions that went beyond strict interpretation of regulations, but he stood by those decisions and said he would make them again in the same circumstances. Harrison argued that the Federation existed to promote peace and cooperation among intelligent species, and that sometimes promoting those values required flexibility and judgment rather than rigid adherence to rules. He said he was willing to accept whatever consequences the council deemed appropriate, but he would not apologize for trying to prevent the extinction of an entire species. Finally, it was Theron's turn to speak. The Kalari elder walked to the witness stand, moving carefully in the earth gravity that was still difficult for him. He wore traditional Kalari robes that had been adapted for the warmer temperature, and he carried a ceremonial staff carved from ice that had been specially treated to prevent melting. Theron looked at the assembled council members and began to speak through the translator device that rendered his words into Federation standard. The elder told the story of his people from their perspective. He described the slow descent into desperation as the cold increased and resources dwindled. He talked about the moral decay that accompanied physical survival, as families turned inward and abandoned the old values of community and sharing. Theron explained that his people had been dying not just physically but spiritually, and that they had lost hope of finding any way forward. Then the humans came, and a small child performed a simple act that reminded the Kalari of who they used to be and who they could choose to become. Again, Theron said that the humans had not saved the Kalari or imposed solutions on them or made them dependent. What Emma and her people had done was hold up a mirror that showed the Kalari their own potential for compassion and cooperation. The changes in Kalari society were not human ideas forced on unwilling natives, but Kalari ideas rediscovered and reclaimed. The elder said that his people were grateful for human contact and for the knowledge and temporary aid they had received. But they did not want to be pitied or rescued or controlled. They wanted to be recognized as fellow beings, struggling with difficult challenges, and they wanted the right to accept help from friends when that help was offered in good faith. The hearing room was absolutely silent as Theron finished his testimony. Then he did something unexpected. He asked permission to present a gift to the council, and when they agreed, he produced a carefully wrapped package. Inside was a replica of the blue thermal blanket carved entirely from ice in perfect detail. The Kalari had worked for weeks to create it using techniques taught by Peter Collins and their own artistic traditions. Theron presented the ice blanket to the council president and said it represented the Kalari commitment to remember the lesson Emma had taught them and to honor the friendship between their peoples. The Federation Council deliberated for 3 days behind closed doors while the galaxy waited for their decision. During that time, Emma and Theron spent hours together walking through the parks of Geneva and talking about their respective worlds. The Kalari elder was amazed by Earth's warmth and the abundance of life that thrived in temperatures he found almost unbearably hot. Emma showed him flowers and trees and told him about seasons that brought growth instead of death. Theron shared stories about the beauty of ice formations and the aurora, lights that danced across Theta 7s, polar skies, and the way sound carried differently in the extreme. When the council finally emerged to announce their verdict, the hearing room was packed beyond capacity. The council president was a dignified woman named Catherine Ross, who had served in the Federation Diplomatic Corps for decades before her election to the council. She stood at the podium and began reading the decision in a clear voice that carried to every corner of the room and across the communication networks to the far reaches of Federation space. The council found that Captain Harrison had indeed violated certain protocols regarding first contact and provision of aid to primitive civilizations. However, they also found that these violations were justified by extraordinary circumstances and by the fundamental Federation principle of preventing suffering when possible. The council ruled that Harrison would receive an official reprimand in his record, but no further punishment. The ongoing aid program on Theta 7 would continue, under revised guidelines that emphasized knowledge transfer and temporary support rather than permanent dependency. But the most important part of the decision was what came next. The council announced the establishment of what they called the Collins Principle, named after Emma and her act of compassion. This new doctrine stated that basic humanitarian aid to beings in immediate distress did not constitute cultural interference regardless of their technological level. The principle acknowledged that compassion was a universal value that transcended species boundaries and that the Federation had an obligation to help others when they were suffering, and when help was requested or clearly needed. The Collins Principle created exceptions to non-interference policies for specific circumstances. If a species was facing extinction from natural causes, the Federation could provide aid. If individuals were in immediate mortal danger, the Federation could intervene to save lives. If a civilization requested knowledge or assistance, the Federation could provide it within certain parameters. The principle included safeguards against exploitation and requirements for transparency and consent, but fundamentally it represented a shift in Federation philosophy from strict non-interference toward compassionate engagement. The announcement of the verdict brought cheers from much of the gallery, though. Admiral Peterson and his supporters sat in stony silence. Captain Harrison shook hands with his legal team and hugged his crew members who had supported him throughout the ordeal. Dr. Blake was already thinking about how to implement the new guidelines in his ongoing work with the Kalari. Emma did not fully understand all the implications, but she knew that the adults seemed happy and relieved, so she smiled too. Theron approached the podium and asked permission to speak once more. Council President Ross granted it, and the Kalari elder thanked the Federation for their wisdom and their willingness to recognize the Kalari as partners rather than subjects. He announced that the Kalari villages had voted to pursue formal diplomatic relations with the Federation and to accept membership as a protectorate species, with the goal of eventual full Federation membership when they achieved the necessary technological and social development. This was an unprecedented step for a pre-industrial civilization, but the Council accepted the offer and welcomed the Kalari into the Federation family. The years that followed saw remarkable progress on Theta 7. The Kalari continued to develop their communal society while adapting human knowledge to their own needs and conditions. They learned to build better shelters and to hunt more efficiently, and to preserve food more effectively. The population stabilized and then began to slowly grow for the first time in generations. Villages that had been abandoned were reoccupied and new settlements were established in areas that had been too cold to survive in before. The children who grew up in this new era knew a very different world than their parents and grandparents had experienced. They learned both Kalari traditions and Federation knowledge. They played games that combined elements from both cultures. They grew up believing that cooperation and sharing were natural, and that different species could be friends and partners. Baby Emma became a symbol of this new generation, and as she grew, she carried the name and the legacy with pride and responsibility. Emma Collins continued to visit Theta 7 regularly as she grew older. She watched baby Emma learn to walk and talk and eventually to read and write in both Kalari and Federation standard. The two Emmas developed a bond that transcended species difference and became as close as sisters, despite being light years apart most of the time. Human Emma learned Kalari spiritual practices and hunting techniques, while Kalari Emma learned earth games and human music. They wrote letters to each other using the communication system Dr. Blake had set up, and they dreamed together about the future when travel between worlds would be as easy as walking between villages. When human Emma turned 18, she enrolled in the Federation Xenoanthropology Institute following in Dr. Blake's footsteps. Her application essay about her experiences on Theta 7 became famous and was published in academic journals and popular magazines across the Federation. Emma argued that true understanding between species required not just scientific study, but genuine friendship and shared experience. She wrote about how a 6-year-old's instinct to help a cold baby had taught her more about diplomacy and cultural exchange than any textbook could. The Kalari, meanwhile, continued their steady development toward technological advancement. They discovered how to extract metals from the ice by using geothermal heat to melt deep layers and filter the water. They developed a form of glass made from sand and ice that could be used for better insulation and for lenses that improved their ability to see in low light. They created a written language based on ice carving that could be preserved indefinitely in the cold. Each innovation built on both their own traditions and knowledge, gained from Federation contact. 50 years after first contact, the Kalari achieved their first major technological breakthrough. A team of Kalari engineers working with human advisors developed a method for generating power from the temperature differential between the surface ice and the geothermal heat below. This clean renewable energy source allowed for better heating and lighting and powered tools that made construction and manufacturing much easier. The Kalari were beginning the transition from a pre-industrial to an industrial society on their own terms and in their own way. The baby who had received Emma's blanket grew into a remarkable adult. Kalari Emma became a leader in her community and eventually a diplomat representing her people in Federation affairs. She studied human culture and language with the same dedication that human Emma studied Kalari ways. When she was 30 years old by Kalari reckoning, which was roughly equivalent to 25 human years, she was chosen to lead the Kalari's first space mission. The Kalari had developed spacecraft with Federation technical assistance, but the design and construction were entirely their own work. The destination for this historic first flight was Earth. Kalari Emma wanted to visit the homeworld of the girl who had saved her life and changed the course of history for her entire species. The journey took months even with Federation help to navigate the corridors between stars. When the Kalari ship finally entered Earth's solar system, it was greeted by a fleet of Federation vessels and escorted to a hero's welcome, human. Emma was 56 years old when Kalari Emma arrived on Earth. She was now Dr. Emma Collins, a renowned xenoanthropologist and professor who had dedicated her career to studying cultural exchange and peaceful coexistence between species. She had married and had children of her own, and her eldest daughter was studying to follow in her mother's footsteps. When Emma learned that her Kalari namesake was coming to Earth, she cleared her schedule and prepared for a reunion that had been decades in the making. They met at Federation headquarters, in the same building where the hearing had been held so many years before. Kalari Emma carried a case made of carved ice that had been specially treated to survive Earth's warm temperature. Inside the case, wrapped in protective materials, was the blue thermal blanket that had started everything. It was faded now and worn from years of careful preservation, but the heating filaments still worked when activated. Kalari Emma presented the blanket to human Emma, and the two women embraced while cameras recorded the moment for broadcast across the Federation. Human Emma held the blanket she had not seen since childhood and felt tears running down her face. She remembered being 6 years old and cold and seeing a baby who needed warmth more than she did. She remembered not thinking about consequences or politics or making history, but just doing what felt right in that moment.